When you're ready, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honors. As the commander of the unit, Simatović was a powerful and well-connected man. If Simatović was some low functionary, as he claims throughout his brief, unit members like Dejan Stanišić would not have considered him their commander. We would also not see him sharing a couch with Martic, Karadzic, Krajishnik, Zhublianin, and Stanišić, as we see in Exhibit P391. Nor would he have attended planning meetings for military operations, like the February 1993 meeting with senior leadership of the VRS and VJ regarding Operation Udar, as P392 shows he did. The prosecution would additionally refer the chamber to rows B3 to B7 of the confidential evidence chart. Throughout the defense cases and their final trial briefs, both accused challenged the continuity of the unit between 1991 up until its formalization as the JATD in 1993. Before discussing evidence related to the unit's early existence, the prosecution would like to note some additional statements by the accused Stanišić in his final brief. In paragraphs 497 and 514, Stanišić makes a number of concessions with respect to the unit's existence prior to 1993. Some of these statements are now on the slide before the chamber. In paragraph 497, Stanišić acknowledges that he had control over a unit known as the Red Berets between August-September 1991 until the end of February 1992 as, quote, part of his aim to create an anti-terrorist unit, ATU, unquote. And, quote, Stanišić intended to use the 28 selected to create an ATU, unquote. By making these concessions, Stanišić is not challenging the prosecution's case that he had the authority to create and control the DB Special Unit known as the Red Berets at some point prior to his official appointment as Chief of the Service in 1992. He is also not challenging the prosecution's case that a DB unit known as the Red Berets existed prior to its reformalization as the JATD, albeit in a limited form for a 6 to 7 month period. The evidence in this case does not support these limited conclusions, and it shows the unit existed at all times from May 1991 onward. As a general observation, Stanišić tries to redesignate his Red Berets between 1991 and 1992 as the ATU throughout his brief. However, this is not what the unit was commonly referred to in documents prior to 1993. As seen in a significant quantity of materials admitted in this case, it was often referred to as the Special Purpose Unit of the MUP Serbia, a unit the evidence shows existed between 1991 and 1993 until being renamed the JATD. The prosecution provides references to examples of these documents in row B8 of the confidential evidence chart. In paragraphs 37 to 63 of his brief, Stanišić acknowledges some of the individuals who were present in Fruška Gora for portions of either 1991 or 1992, including unit members Laka, Pilipović, Bojan Vučković, and the Božić brothers. These were all individuals who joined the unit in Golubich prior to August 1991. The prosecution would refer the chamber to Annex A of its brief for further description of evidence related to these unit members. With Your Honor's leave, the prosecution requests to turn into private session.
Turn to private session. Thank you, Madam Registrar.
The evidence in this case also shows that not all members of the unit were in Fruška Gora and Pajos after July 1991. Milan Babić, JF-31, and JF-39 all provided evidence that unit members continued their operations in the Krajina after Golubich. Milan Babić testified that Frankie's base, a base of the Serbian DB, was in Korenica after August 1991. This can be found on page 335 of P1878. The prosecution would additionally refer the chamber to rows B19 to B24 of the confidential evidence chart. Simatović himself admits to the continuing involvement of the DB in the Krajina during the Kula award ceremony, when he stated that, quote, "The unit provided important support in the liberation of the Republic of Serbian Krajina," unquote. He then stated, quote, "Around 5,000 soldiers were engaged in these battles, and their actions were coordinated by the unit command and intelligence team from the Second Administration," unquote. In other words, the accused used people from the Second Administration, along with unit members, to coordinate the actions of other Serb forces who were controlled by Milan Mardić. Before continuing with further submissions on the continuity of the unit, the prosecution would briefly make a few points about two witnesses relied upon in the defense briefs and related to the events in the Krajina. The first witness, Acho Dracha. He greatly minimized evidence related to the conduct of the accused and Milan Mardić. During cross-examination, the witness displayed his bias, and the chamber had to caution the witness on repeated occasions to provide complete answers and tell the whole truth about interactions between the Krajina and Serbian DBs. For example, he testified that there were rumors of Rade Kostić working for the Serbian DB, but he couldn't remember who said that to him. He later acknowledged that he knew that Milan Mardić himself had claimed that. On this occasion, he was cautioned by the chamber to tell the whole truth. On another occasion, he absolutely asserted that there was never a plan or proposal to join the RSK DB to the Serbian DB. He later acknowledged that Milan Mardić frequently proposed the very same idea to him. Specific examples of his unreliable testimony can also be found in his evidence related to the charged crimes in the indictment. Dracha portrayed the crimes committed in Bruška as a private feud between a few citizens on direct examination. He stated at page 16765 that the villagers from Bruška were interviewed by the Krajina police and, quote, no statements were taken from them, unquote. Admitted in evidence as P43 is an official record of an interview completed by the Benkovac SJB, the very station that Dracha worked for. This record includes the account of Jasna Denona just 4 days after the murders charged in the indictment, and shows the Benkovac SJB possessed information that the Krajina police were the perpetrators of the murders in Bruška. This witness's evidence related to the perpetrators of the Srebrenice massacre is also inaccurate when compared to other exhibits, such as D675, which does not reference the 63rd Parachute Brigade as being one of the JNA units engaged in these operations. Dracha's evidence regarding Srebrenice is also contradicted by prosecution exhibits 2802, 1212, and 1209. The second witness, Goran Opačić, was convicted for the crimes committed in Srebrenice according to exhibits P3106 and P3107. In his brief, Simatović does not rely upon Opačić's evidence related to the massacre in Srebrenice, but instead relies upon his denials that the accused were involved with the training and activities of Serb forces in the Krajina. This witness is wholly uncredible. For example, he claimed to never have any interactions with Stanišić before the Kula award ceremony in 1997. However, as you can see on slide number 47 before you, Stanišić greeted Opačić, unlike many of the other members of the unit at Kula, with a kiss. And then, during his unscripted remarks at the ceremony, Opačić was the first person mentioned by Stanišić out of all the members of the unit present that day. When confronted with his prominent role during the presentation of awards at page 18313, the witness provided an unconvincing answer about his exchange with Stanišić. His answer is provided on slide number 48. Even this witness's own brother and fellow unit member admitted in exhibit P2824 that he was, quote, cooperating with the RDB from the very beginning via the Golubic camp, unquote. Returning to the continuity of the unit between 1991 and 1993. As already seen, Stanišić acknowledges that the Red Berets existed during the fall of 1991 and spring of 1992. There were individuals who joined the unit during this time that are centrally relevant to this case. Two of these individuals, both relevant to the crimes committed in Bosanski Shamac, were Dragan Đorđević, aka Crni, and Alexander Vukovic. Crni joined the unit in October 1991 as part of the unit's active service. His personnel file shows that by February 1992, Crni was based in Lezhimir as the commander of the 1st Rifle Squad. In P2984, another report by Zhivorian Ivanovich from December 1991 indicates that Cerny had been stationed in Elac. According to Stephen Todorovich, in P1576, Alexander Vukovic was one of the instructors with the DB Special Unit in Elac before being deployed to Bosanski Shamats. A document from Vukovic's personnel records, admitted as P3154, further confirms he was a member of the unit in February 1992 and joined as an assistant machine gunner. Both Cerny and Vukovic are mentioned in a December 1992 entry from the Mladic notebooks. This entry reflects a meeting between Mladic and members of the Shamats municipality, including Stephen Todorovich. On slide 50 are Mladic's notes of what Todorovich said at the meeting. Todorovich stated that there were men sent to Elac for training, and on 18 April 1992, they were transferred together on helicopters with 30 volunteers from Kragujevac, and among them were two members of the Serbian MUP, Dragan Đorđević, aka Cerny, and Alexander Vukovic. This exhibit represents significant corroboration of the 92 Quater testimony of Todorovich and shows that locals from Shamats were sent to Elac for training by the Serbian MUP and then returned to Bosnia with former SRS volunteers and members of the Serbian MUP. In conjunction with other evidence related to Cerny, Vukovic, and Elac, it is clear that the DB were the ones who provided this training and oversaw the perpetrators of crimes upon the deployment to Bosanski Shamats in April 1992. During their deployment to Bosanski Shamats, the individuals who were trained in Elac considered themselves to be part of a unit called the Grey Wolves and Red Berets. Stanišić attacks the credibility of JF-47 and attempts to distinguish the Grey Wolves from the Red Berets as being associated to two different units in paragraphs 588 to 592 of his brief. They were not two different units. As seen on the slide before the chamber, the Grey Wolf patch worn by the unit is admitted as P141. The same emblem was also placed on the unit's own forms, as seen in the exhibit P2786. Also depicted on the slide, the wolf insignia was used by the Red Berets on the wall of the Kula Center to show the locations of their operations. In P2976, the same wolf symbol was worn by Simatović on his own Red Beret. The prosecution would additionally refer the chamber to row B25 of the confidential evidence chart. In paragraph 278 of its brief, the prosecution discusses the unit members who were killed during operations prior to 1993. The Serbian DB extended posthumous awards or payments to many of these individuals. These recognitions further illustrate that the unit continually existed between 1991 and 1993. The prosecution requests that the next slide not be broadcast to the public. One of these individuals was Milan Dimic, a unit member who was killed in Doughboy on 13 July 1992. One day after approximately 27 non-Serb civilians were removed from Perchin's disco and killed while forming part of a human shield for the Red Berets and other Serb forces. For his efforts, the Serbian DB extended 62 payments to Dimic's relatives between 1993 and 1995 and recognized him with an award in 1996, which is noted on the slide before the chamber. Between April and July 1992, other members of the unit were also involved in the training in Ozren and operations in Doughboy. 3 witnesses in this case, all named Lija Božović and Davor Subotić, aka Ricky, as possessing a commanding role in these operations. The prosecution would refer the chamber to rows B26 to B29 of the confidential evidence chart. And Your Honors, again with your leave, if we could please turn to private session.
We turn into private session.
Being up a session, Your Honor.
Thank you, Madam Registrar.
Both accused argue that they only did things that they were permitted or required to do by the Serbian law and certain regulations. For example, at paragraph 100 of his brief, Stanišić claims that he was a stickler for rules, quote unquote. The next 25 pages of his brief analyzes those rules and requests an inference that Stanišić did only the things permitted by the regulations. This argument is contradicted by the accused's own concession that an anti-terrorist unit was formed between 91 and 92 and did exist after the fall of 1993. There is no provision in any of the relevant laws or regulations permitting the DB to form an armed unit. Nevertheless, the evidence has shown they did. Lastly, the Stanišić defense weaves arguments about notice throughout its final trial brief. With respect to the Stanišić defense claim that the only unit sufficiently pled is the, quote, 28 elite trainers, unquote, the prosecution asserts that the special units of the Serbian DB, which were the focus of this case, were clearly set out in the indictment, particularly paragraphs 4 and 6. And that is consistent with the evidence presented by the prosecution. With respect to the defense contention that the names of certain individuals contained in the evidence tendered by the prosecution are material facts which should have been pled in the indictment, the defense confuses evidence with material facts. The third amended indictment pled the material facts which underpin the charges in a manner sufficient to inform the accused of the charges and allow him to prepare his defense. The names of individuals, whether physical perpetrators or tools or simply otherwise relevant individuals, are a matter of evidence. At this time, Ms. Friedman will continue the prosecution's submissions with your leave.
afternoon, Your Honors. The prosecution has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused are liable for the deployment and operations of Archon's SDG in numerous locations, including in SBWS, Bielina, Zvornik, and Sansky Most, where they committed the charged crimes which were the object of the JCE. I will begin by speaking about the credibility of prosecution witness JF57 and defense witnesses Dmitrievich and Pelovich in relation to Archon's connection to and reliance on the Serbian DB. Those are the first two items listed on slide 56 before you. I will next discuss issues related to SBWS. First, Simatović's liability for crimes, item 3, and then 3 points in relation to Stanišić's liability, items 4 through 6. My final 3 points relate to the Bielina and Zvornik crime bases. I will now move into private session for approximately 5 minutes.
We move into private session.
We need open session, Your Honors.
Thank you, Madam Magistrate. Could you please adjust your speed of speech?
Dmitrievich testified that Sergeant Golubovich, the SDG member depicted in P605, kicking civilians lying on the street in Bielina, was punished for his conduct by removal from the SDG. He emphasized that this kind of conduct was unacceptable in the SDG. Only when confronted on cross-examination by the fact that Golubovich appeared on a DB payment list from 1995 did Dmitrievich acknowledge that it was practice that people were forgiven at some time. Witness Pelovich cannot be considered a witness of truth in light of his more than evident admiration towards Archon, whom he still considers to be a hero of the Serbian people. This admiration led to biased and dishonest evidence, as demonstrated by his statement that he never heard of crimes being committed by Archon or members of the SDG in SBWS, and affirmed that he had still not heard of such things, even at the time that he testified. Pelovich offered evidence that was demonstrably false. When asked whether the SDG ever participated in combat with the Scorpions, Pelovich answered, quote, "No, never," unquote. The prosecution has tendered video footage of joint operations seen on P483, as well as additional documentary and witness evidence. It is highly unlikely that Pelovich did not know about joint operations between these units. And even if it were the case that he did not have actual knowledge and chose to remain willfully blind, as he claims to have done in respect of Archon's criminal record, that too should preclude any reliance being placed on testimony he offered. In another instance, Pelovich asserted that he was sure that nobody from the Serbian MUP or DB came to the Erdut training center, while also stating that Baja often came to the Erdut training centers. Your Honors will find this at T16337 to 16338. Giving Pelovich the benefit of the doubt of what he knew at the time of the events, he must have later learned that even when Baja first arrived to the region and commanded the TO, he was also a high-profile employee of the Serbian MUP. Yet he unabashedly provided evidence that no one from the Serbian MUP came to the Air Duty Training Center, because he was determined to provide evidence which distanced the SDG from the Serbian DB. Simatović argues that there is no evidence linking him to Arkan, and cites Gagic's evidence that he never saw him in Slavonia. There is certainly more evidence of Simatovic's personal presence in Krajina than of his presence in SBWS. It is important to bear in mind that the charged crimes in these two regions were occurring simultaneously. Simatović is responsible for the crimes in SBWS because they were part of the common criminal plan, and he was a member of the JCE. His main contribution at that point in time was in the Krajina, and that was a significant contribution to the JCE. Simatović made contributions in the SBWS as well by setting up bases there and participating in the attack on Vukovar. Yet, even if he had not made a significant contribution in SBWS, his liability for the crimes rests firmly on his participation in the JCE. Both defense teams have accepted the evidence that Baja and Arkan cooperated closely in the SBWS. The defense attempt to dispute the link between Arkan and the DB in two ways. First, by breaking the link between the public security and state security, or Stanišić and Baja. And secondly, by discounting the evidence that DB operatives were acting on Stanishic's behalf. Stanišić emphasizes Baja's presence and claims that his own absence is significant. However, the fact that Baja was actually deployed to SBWS in the fall of 1991 does not diminish Stanishic's responsibility. First, Stanišić was present in the region at key moments and was very well informed about what was occurring there. Second, Stanišić cooperated closely with Baja and the other JCE members, including Hadžić, Milošević, Bogdanović, and Arkan. Third, Stanišić ensured that the men he was in charge of, including Kostić and Kojić, provided vital assistance to JCE members Hadžić, Baja, and Arkan, who were on the ground in SBWS. The Stanišić brief at paragraph 417 claims that there is, quote, not a single piece of reliable evidence to support the assertion that Baja took orders or even advice from Stanišić, unquote. Stanišić would apparently dismiss the evidence of General Milovanović, referred to earlier by Mr. Farr, and which appears now on slide 65. The only reasonable inference based on General Milovanović's evidence is that when Baja said, "I arrived here with the boss," he was referring to Stanišić. In cross-examination, the defense challenged this evidence on the basis that according to their de jure positions, Stanišić should not have been Baja's boss. This is an example of where the evidence of what actually transpired portrays a situation that is different than what the laws dictated. Milovanovic's evidence about this meeting, in which he found Stanisić's knowledge to be astounding, attests to Stanisić's role in planning and coordinating actions in furtherance of the JCE on behalf of the Serbian government, and explains why he may have functioned as Baja's boss, even though, legally speaking, Baja was not subordinated to him. The prosecution requests that the next slide not be broadcast. Even putting aside the evidence that Stanišić had de facto authority over Baja, this is but one instance where Stanišić attempts to elevate the prosecution's evidentiary burden by suggesting that the prosecution must prove beyond reasonable doubt certain facts which are not necessary in order to prove the accused's responsibility. The fact is that Stanišić and Baja, as heads of state security and public security of the Serbian MUP, worked closely with Milosevic and cooperated with each other during the indictment period, providing significant Serbian MUP resources to the other JCE members. Slides 66 and 67 contain examples of the evidence Your Honors have heard about the cooperation between the state security and public security, both between the heads of the services and members operating in the field. Stanišić provides evidence about cooperation between members of the Psi unit under Baja and the JTD under Stanišić and Simatović, which is corroborated further by the interview with Obrad Stevanović, contained in P973, and other operations and other evidence of joint operations that Ms. Harbour will discuss. It is also important to bear in mind that references to the Serbian MUP do not refer only to public security. The Serbian MUP contains two divisions, the public security and state security, and a reference to the Serbian MUP can refer to either of them. The prosecution requests that the next slide not be broadcast. Slide number 68 contains two documents which refer to DB members as employees of the Serbian MUP without further specification. Furthermore, it is apparent in the evidence that individuals who were not closely affiliated with the DB may not have known whether a particular person worked for public security or state security due to their intertwined activities. I refer the chamber, for example, to the evidence of Borovoje Savić at T1876. Perhaps the best example of the intertwined nature of the services is Kojić's statement, P1698, seen on slide 69, wherein he asserts that even while he was officially employed by the Serbian MUP public security, he was actually answering to Stanišić. I will now move to a discussion of Stanisić's responsibility for the acts of his subordinates as they relate to his liability for crimes in SBWS and in Bijeljina Zbornik. Stanišić argues at paragraph 734 that the prosecution has not shown evidence that Stanišić provided instructions or orders to Kostić, or that Kostić's actions were in furtherance of a DB policy, and suggests that the prosecution is inappropriately resting liability on an employment relationship. The prosecution has demonstrated that Kostić's actions were carried out in accordance with how Stanišić intended to use the Serbian DB to further the JCE. The prosecution does not need to produce evidence of an order directly from Stanišić to Kostić in order to meet its burden of proof. Stanišić was the man in charge, and as such he could be expected to be well informed, but he was even better informed than expected. Mr. Farr has discussed this issue, recounting evidence from witnesses Milovanović and Čorbić. I will provide you with two more examples of this evidence. In January 1992, Stanišić affirmed to Karadzic that he had the ability to appoint people in SBWS. Excerpts from this conversation appear on slide 71. Stanišić discussed having been present in the field in order to talk to commanders and state that he would be responsible for creating, quote, some kind of concept, unquote. Defense witness Knežević testified at T13542 that Stanišić had a conversation with him about the situation in SBWS when Stanišić was passing through the area. He asked Knežević to confirm certain information that he had received from DB operative Lazar Šarac. This shows that Stanišić had personal knowledge of information reported by DB operatives who were several levels beneath him in the DB hierarchy, and that he actively sought additional information. The only reasonable inference based on Stanišić's level of knowledge and personal involvement is that the actions of his employees were pursuant to the direction in which he led the Serbian DB. It is clear that he established a policy of helping the Serb forces perpetrate JCE crimes. I would like to move into private session for approximately 8 minutes.
We move into private session.
Need a possession, Your Honor.
Thank you, Madam Register.
The words and actions of Milan Martic offer further evidence of Kostić's association with Stanišić. I refer Your Honors to the intercepted conversation P1605 on slide 73. In this call, Martic irately implores Milosevic to have Stanišić remove Kostić and the rest of what he refers to as Stanisić's gang from Erdut and Paisos. Milosevic denies that these men are Stanisić's men, but in fact, Kostić's personnel file leaves no doubt that he was working for Stanišić at that time. Simatović referred to Kostić at the Kula camp celebration as a, quote, distinguished member of this unit, unquote. I will now discuss several issues in relation to the accused's liability for the Zvornik crime base. The defense again argued that the crimes were planned and carried out by other JCE members without their involvement. The prosecution requests that the next slide not be broadcast. In trying to dismiss the evidence that Marko Pavlović, commander of the Zvornik TO, was a member of the Serbian DB, Stanišić attempts to challenge the evidence of three witnesses at paragraph 739 of his brief, claiming that the evidence of each is uncorroborated, when in fact they are three independent sources of evidence that corroborate each other, as summarized in slide number 75. First, the Stanišić's brief misstates JF61's evidence. Stanišić states that according to JF61, Pavlovich claimed to have a DB ID, which is a clear indication of the falsity of his claims. Your honors can see what JF61 actually said in the confidential evidence table at row C1. Thus, the evidence is not that Pavlovich claimed to have a card issued by the DB. B161 provides evidence of Pavlovich's close relationship with Topavchevich, which your honors will find at rows C2 and C3 of the confidential evidence table. Stanišić urges the chamber to dismiss this evidence, which he claims is uncorroborated. This applies an overly stringent approach. It is not necessary for another witness to offer the exact same facts. Evidence of a connection with Topavchevich is evidence of a connection with the DB. Stanišić then asks the chamber to disregard JF26's evidence by asserting that JF26 retracted his evidence that Topavchevich was Pavlovich's boss. First, this assertion is erroneous, since JF26's evidence was about Kostic, not Pavlovich. Further, JF26 did not retract this evidence altogether. JF26's testimony was that Kostic worked for the Serbian MUP, but he could no longer remember the name of his superior at the time. JF26 also testified that Pavlovich referred to Kostic as his boss, which is another point of corroboration on his connection to the DB. JF26 also offered evidence which indirectly bolsters B161's credibility and attests to the independence of these two witnesses. Your honors will find that evidence and brief confidential arguments at rows C4 to C6 of the confidential evidence table. As he did with Kostic, Stanišić argues that actions committed by Topavchevich cannot be impugned to Stanišić. The prosecution submits that the fact that Topavchevich was Stanišić's deputy leads to a strong inference that he was acting pursuant to Stanišić's directions. I will discuss just one piece of evidence that makes this the only reasonable inference. In December 1993, a meeting that was attended by the key leaders from Serbia and Republika Srpska was hosted at the DB headquarters in Belgrade. This meeting was discussed in detail during the prosecution's 98 bis submissions and earlier by Mr. Farr. It is exhibit P2532 and is on slide 77. At this time, I would simply draw your honors' attention to the Serbian MUP attendees of this meeting, who were Sokolović, Stanišić, Baja, and Topavčević. Stanišić presided over the meeting, and Sokolović and Baja both spoke during different points in time, whereas Topavčević, outranked by all these men, did not. The meeting demonstrates Stanisić's intent to use the resources available to him to contribute to the JCE on the territory of the Republika Srpska, as well as the fact that Topavčević was well aware of this. With respect to Stanisić's liability for the crimes in Zvornik, the Stanišić defense brief at paragraphs 771 to 772 asks the question, why would Stanišić be involved in the takeover of Zvornik and arrange supplies for paramilitaries, only to later arrest the Vučković brothers for crimes? A possible answer to the question, if the evidence that the arrest occurred at Stanisić's behest is believed, is that he felt compelled to do so for political reasons. The arrests occurred more than a year and a half later, at a time when reports about the crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina were being published. The arrest of only 2 individuals is insignificant in light of the evidence of the DV's involvement in those crimes. The more telling question is why these were the only arrests that were made at that time. Both of the Vučković brothers, in their statements to the DV, provided information about heinous crimes perpetrated by Marko Pejić, one of Arkan's men. I refer Your Honors to an excerpt of Vojan Vučković's statement, P2987, which appears at row C7 of the confidential evidence table.
Sweetman, I'm looking at the clock. Time for a break,
Yes,
if this is a suitable moment.
yes, this is a suitable moment.
Yes. We have another 75 minutes after the break, which would bring us to approximately, let me just, which would mean that you'd meet tomorrow, I take it, not necessarily you, but perhaps I should address you, Mr. Groom, another 25 minutes, is that?
I think at the pace we're going, Your Honor, we may finish today.
That would be appreciated. Then we can hear and it makes it easier perhaps also for the